get me, Chris Ince, back again to talk a little bit about this. But I'm going to talk a little bit forward-looking. So the idea is to kind of bookend our talk today. We started off at the beginning with kind of the reality of where we were, what our portfolio is, and just our vision of the products we have. You heard about what we're building, and now let's just kind of talk strategically, where are we orienting ourselves? Again, there's going to be, of course, some roadmap in here. So again, hey, we reserve the right to change our minds and do something different. But this is kind of where we stand today in the way we're looking at things and what we want to do. It all centers around that security fabric again. So this continues to be the guiding pillar. Even as we go through the slides I'm about to talk about, this stays the same. And as I joked earlier, there's been a version of this drawn differently, circles look a little different, but this concept for the past 5-6 years. So this has been sort of a North Star for us, something that we follow for my entire time here. One of this is this concept of FortiOS everywhere. And if it's not clear, that's of course the operating system that runs on our FortiGates. So this idea that we have a challenge, with all this separate vendor, everything I talked about when I talked about that complexity. So what do we do about that? Well, we can look at utilizing a common fabric centered around FortiOS to give convergence to a single platform and use that as a way of looking forward and solving all problems in the best way possible. And that's going to be how we will continue to build our strategy. As Sumant was going through the FortiSASE, I think he hinted at this to a certain extent, but let's make it fairly explicit. For example, the security that's happening at the core of FortiSASE is still essentially a virtualized FortiGate. That security, this idea of the FortiOS, it's still at the heart of everything we're doing. So architecturally, to the conversation we were having about, hey, do I go FortiSASE? Do I go on-site? What does that really look like? Those may be radically different topologies. And it may be a complete philosophical discussion of which path I follow. The idea that I'm still leveraging this operating system, its capabilities and what we want to do as the core of what we build continues to be what we're building towards.
But that's the OS on the networking appliances. You don't run FortiOS as the AI ops host operating system that you're running.
Right? That's true. So it's not the host operating system for like FortiAI ops.
The VMs and
but in a sense, if you think about where AI ops gets all of its information, it's coming in through FortiOS.
Okay.
So as we continue to look at how we build out, it's interesting because we tend to build out while at the same time folding in as part of that overall fabric that centers around FortiOS. So there's a lot of power in terms of how we do this. So we talked about, SASE, but you think about things like SD-WAN and all of our LAN edge stuff comes back, centers around FortiOS. ZTNA, which, I know it's acronym soup, but when you think about ZTNA, which we didn't go through today because it's not really wireless, it's mobility field day, right? SASE, SD-WAN, again, all these things become better when they're harmonized off of this single platform. And this again also comes down to this idea of how many, I think it kind of relates to the question you asked, which is how many different solutions do I have to buy? How much different stuff do I want to have? Well, that answer I gave you around like FortiManager, the more we can linchpin off of a common platform, the easier we can make it in terms of, well, where do I go to configure and manage that? Well, it's based off FortiOS, which means you can go to that same management platform because that's now managing all of that. So it all homes home to the same thing, which gives you a lot of extensibility. Which kind of builds to an interesting idea of, so in that, what does kind of a next generation NOC look like? What does a network operations center look like in this model? And this is something that, as we've bridged more and more, and I know it's weird, like, wait a minute, the security company is talking about what the NOC looks like? Are you sure that's not supposed to be an S? But no, we're looking at what should that NOC look like? And So it kind of starts with the build of this idea of the fabric. Again, where's all that information coming from? How do I bring everything together? Well, it starts with the fabric. I can get telemetry from various places, but there's still some challenge there because I don't necessarily have a great visibility across all the different pieces, but I can solve that if I start to harmonize my LAN edge. We talked a little bit about that today, single pane, single policy. If I bring the LAN together, then that brings that together. But I still have some problems around managing all that. Well, we hinted at that as well. If I have a single management piece that can take care of all this because it's all brought together, well, then that solves it. That brings everything together in one place. But that can still be a hassle to deal with. Well, that kind of relates then to what Alex was talking about. I can bring AI ops to bear to make that easier to deal with. Okay, well, that sounds pretty good so far, but what about other systems, things that are not necessarily part of my overall Fortinet stack that are outside the network, other applications, other need, or what the user's actually dealing with, which can be more application-based? That's where we have things like digital experience monitoring. And our GEM product is called FortiMonitor. One of the few times it wasn't FortiGEM. I know it's kind of shocking. We actually, I think, went through this in a mobility field day several years ago. We didn't want to repeat that necessarily today, but the idea that now I can extend beyond the Fortinet footprint and into what users are experiencing, that can be at the application level, servers, and even cloud-based applications that are beyond what IT has direct control over, but I can still monitor and understand that. Well, that's good. And that starts to get me a lot of stuff as I'm kind of progressing deeper and deeper into the network and into the NOC. There kind of is this one last piece. Well, how do I do more network learning? How can I really understand what's going on and application security at that level? That's where we have FortiPolicy. And I know that this becomes a lot of Forti names, so the kind of thing becomes, okay, well, that's great, Chris. You just talked about all this stuff, but how does that work? What does that really look like? So that vision for us comes down to these different pieces. So from a telemetry perspective, this is the fabric. Core idea, visualize it all. Show me everything. Map those flows in the fabric. The classic diagram that we've shown before where I can see everything in my fabric from one unified view. From the security layer all the way down to the edge. Clients, APs, switches, everything, because it's all interconnected. And it's all working within that common framework. And we have a vision of continuing to expand the footprint of products that are part of this so that we can bring more and more into the fold, because again, that simplifies matters as much as possible for the people who are trying to control and deal with this. I know it's mobility field day. We tend to, I'm a wireless guy. I've been for a long time. I'd love to say that everything begins and ends with Wi-Fi technology. We know it doesn't. So it's got to be bigger than that, and we need to roll as much in to make this as easy as possible, as much as we can. But that is the LAN edge. What do we want to do? Visualize as much as possible. Working to be one of the first vendors to come out with Wi-Fi 7 when it happens. We want to make sure that our customers are ready, prepared for the new technology. We debated, do we do a Wi-Fi 7 unit today? I don't know. I mean, I know we'll probably talk to the delegates after this session is over. My personal belief is that, like so many Wi-Fi standards, there's goods and bads, but what there's definitely for sure with Wi-Fi 7 is hype, like everyone before it. And then we're going to continue to enhance the client insights that we have access to, because we're not just an AP. By virtue of us also having the firewall and seeing all that traffic, we can actually provide a lot of insight into the client, what it's going through and what traffic it's posting. So we'll continue to build those things out. When you get to FortiManager, that's where you have all those centralized policies, sort of things that were discussed earlier in our presentations, of bringing things together, giving you the ability to control, manage everything from a single place, push it all out, allows you to harmonize configuration, harmonize security and networking in the same place. Because again, as I hinted at earlier, complexity tends to lead to bad security. We don't like bad security at Fortinet. One of the things that we usually are keen to stamp out wherever we can find it and see it. And so if we can get these things where the policies are actually controlled in a single place, both in terms of how you're configuring security on your security appliances, but also configuring security on your networking equipment, then that's better security because you can know that those are aligned and you know they won't drift. I think I've said it previous field days, it's one of my favorite analogies. Anytime that you have two things that you've tried to make sure have the same configuration, but there's actually a seam there, it's going to drift. It's just the reality of the situation. Doesn't matter how well you intend to keep those things aligned, they're likely going to drift at some point. We're all human. It's going to happen. But if you can make sure that it's the same policy, you don't have to worry about that. Vision is to continue this, make it more, allow people to actually have managed service options. We talked a little bit ago about, hey, we want to give people as many options as they want to consume this how they want to. And that's going to continue. We're going to continue to build out those options as we look at, FortiGate services, FortiManager as a managed service, and further templates for best practices around wired and wireless built straight into the management platform.
Wasn't sure the right time to ask this, but you've said services a couple of times. Do you have a vision for a 100% Opex network as a service offering that we're hearing about from so many others?
Yeah, NAS is really interesting. And I think we could probably spend, I know you and I could, but we could probably spend, but just generically, we could probably spend the next hour debating NAS and what whether it's good or bad or what are the intricacies of it. It's certainly true that we are looking at NAS and evaluating when we think we might make a play there.
Okay.
It is not something that we are talking about today. It's not something that we are releasing in the near future. So that's not something that we're looking at doing. Now, would I say that we are ignoring that? No. I mean, it's a reality. It's starting to crop its head. It's interesting, it's timely that you asked that. I was with a customer, obviously can't say who, but I was with a customer actually just, was that yesterday or the day before? Gosh, time floats together. And they asked the same thing. And as we were talking, it was interesting because they weren't even sure how much they bought in. But they were in that same boat. They're like, I'm hearing a lot about it. I know it's real, as in like there are people talking, they're doing it. So it's not this vague thing that doesn't exist. But what does that really mean?
Is this right for me?
Yeah. Is it right for me? And do I even fully understand what it would mean as a customer? What they were kind of verbalizing is, do I really understand what this would mean for in 2 years' time for me? I think it's easy for people to visualize at a top line level what it means in terms of, like you said, CapEx to OpEx shift. And I'm not.
There's asset ownership. There's also
there's exactly, and then that's where, to me, I still personally have a lot of questions on what that really looks like practically over time. And that's where we are, to be quite frank, internally is, okay, this is real. It's going to happen. Let's make sure we understand that before we have a bit, come out and start telling people we're doing this, because we, in that sense, and you can probably blame it on us being a security company, security companies tend to be kind of cautious. We don't tend to just kind of wave our hands and go stomping into places. We really want to make sure we've talked this through and understand it. So I would be stunned if, 5 years from now, we're back at another mobility field day. I'd be stunned if there wasn't some aspect of NAS that we would be talking about. But between this and that 5-year thing, I'd be lying if I said I had any feel for where it would land in that.
Perfect.
For AI ops, I think we went through this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Photo monitor, as I said, we kind of see in a lot of ways photo monitor and AI ops as complementary to one another. In a sense, you can almost look at this as you've got this AI and ML thought processing, looking at things for the network as you control as an IT manager. And then you've got all the stuff you really don't have control over, all the applications and all this sort of thing. How do I monitor that space? How do I know that whether or not it's the SaaS service that I leverage, that I do all my business on, that's having issues right now. And that's why this guy's complaining. And that's why I'm having bad user experience. That's what Monitor is all about. We do want to bring these things sort of more together, make them true brothers in the NOC. So that's part of our vision of how this will continue to build out. We see these as important pieces and in that further maturation of what we want to do. And then, as I said, Fortinet policy, this continuous discovery of applications, kind of ML-driven analysis. It's really about automatic policy generation and ensuring that I understand what's going on, really in the heart of my network, in like the data center. And actually, I think we'll have to see in the future. I'm still trying to convince one of my cohorts, James Allen, to talk a little bit more about Fortinet policy, potentially at a future networking field day. I think it would make a really interesting topic to really deep dive into, but I don't think that's our thing today. One last bit that I know was important to Ben and he wanted to talk about, and so I do want to talk about this, is in past mobility field days, comments have come in, both from the delegates here in the room, but I know some of those comments have actually been passed directly on from people on Twitter coming in and saying, hey, we really liked that old cookbook concept. Some of that's gone, seems to have kind of fallen by the wayside. Other vendors in this space have a lot of documentation that I can fall back on to understand how to deploy. And your whole model, to some of the points and questions made, feels a little different, feels a little confusing. Can you help me? I don't see a lot of documentation. So we've been very hard at work on what we call this 4D, design, deploy, et cetera, for documentation around our solutions. And we have a lot more built out now that can be found on our docs site, which unsurprisingly is docs.fortinet.com. Excuse me, go to the wireless section. You'll find a lot of detail there, but it also cross-pollinates, of course. So we have it around SD-WAN, switching, ZTNA. So to some of the questions asked about, well, how does this relate to bringing in like a SASE or any of the other pieces that were discussed today? These are going to bleed into each other, and those documents try to do that. So it's been important to us to try and build that out and address some of the comments and the feedback we get. And that's something we will continue to do as we continue to get questions here in the Mobility Field Day sessions. So some of the specific documents that we actually have published was a secure wireless concept guide around what we see, best practice for that, as well as some campus and other deployments like remote AP. Remote AP is often one that I kind of near and dear to my heart because of how much the world changed in the last couple of years and people didn't think we could ever do it. That's really what I wanted to take folks through. I know there's usually a lot of questions, so perfect, yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Yes, please.
A couple of things that you didn't cover.
Okay, sure.
If I may. When you talked last time about the harmonization of the FortiOS, right? Have there been any feature enhancements of the FortiOS in the last year that we should know about?
Yeah, so a lot of stuff goes on in FortiOS, and sometimes it's a little hard to bubble up what directly applies like to this audience, because as you might imagine, as the operating system runs on the next generation firewall that also includes SD-WAN, and you just heard SASE and those sorts of things, there's a lot in every FortiOS release. And teasing out what's specific to wireless to talk about here can be a little tricky. One of the key ones was actually some of what was talked about in terms of some of the improvements for the troubleshooting and AI ops pieces that we're doing, as well as some of the SAM functionality, all due respect to our SAM here, that were hinted at by Alex. So we enhanced that quite a bit to get it working better with the new plan for AI Ops 2.0. We've also always continued.
So that's an interface kind of enhancement, is it? Or
correct.
The kind of thing? Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So, the idea, and I think there was even a question about, hey, so I'm taking a radio offline. What does that mean? How do I do that? How do I do it in a graceful manner? That was some of the work that we put in to make sure that was a graceful transition, especially, I think, we've all seen this over the years. If you've got two different things that both own the configure device and one of them says, hey, go offline and do this, how do you make sure the device isn't going like, oh, where did that go? So we did a lot of work around that. We continue to make improvements to our algorithm for automatic adjustment of channel against noise, et cetera. especially with the introduction of 6E, because that brings a whole new band to bear. So we did a lot of work in that. Now, those are the sorts of things that one would argue were expected. Obviously we should be doing that, and we did. And then, of course, there was work on the APs themselves to support some of the SASE things that Sumian talked about. So we did a lot of AP work to get SASE running so that could work within our architecture and be that thin edge part of our SASE solution.
Okay. And then my other question, which actually kind of fits in a little bit of what you said was, Fortinet is known for their security, right? I find it interesting that you're flexible in terms of you can deploy however you want, and we want to keep it simple, but we're really strong in security. I find those contradictory. So is there anything that you've seen in the last year that is a security best practice or practices that you would like to tell us that whatever you do, you should do this year? What have you discovered on the security side that's actually critical to us?
So I would be badly misrepresenting myself if I said that I'm a security wonk. I'm a wireless dude. What I will say is that flexibility you're talking about, yes, it can feel weird. The way we tend to look at it, like SASE versus NGFW, on-site appliance versus cloud-based. The reason we home everything on FortiOS, like I talked about, is because we want to ensure that from our perspective, you're not sacrificing on security if you follow the SASE model. That's why we wanted to leverage FortiOS in both places. And we didn't want to go make a separate spur for like whatever the security was on FortiSASE. Because if we did that, then we would have felt like you were truly making a security divergent decision. The way we sort of look at this, because that same FortiOS is at the heart of a SASE structure versus a FortiGate on-site structure, we feel comfortable saying, hey, that's an architectural decision you can make. Probably the biggest place, and this is not news, something you would have already known. The biggest place that we say anything is, if you are going to route traffic around security, most common place for this is something like remote AP, where people will do split tunneling. Some of it goes back for inspection, some of it, I'm just going to dump that straight to the internet. If you choose to do that, think really hard about why and how. In general, I would recommend that you don't do that unless you are 100% confident that what you are branching out doesn't matter and can't possibly be a compromise to your network. I would then challenge somebody to say, can you ever definitively say that? Because usually you can't. But that's probably the single biggest one, and we do talk about split tunneling. Lots of vendors have it. Lots of people always ask us about it. That's usually what I talk about is, yes, we do it. That's a really sharp blade. Make sure you're careful how you go grab that. Past that, I think like any security appliance, if you don't know what you're doing, you can give yourself a false sense of security when you go configure that thing. I would encourage anybody to make sure they understand what they're doing when they're configuring security. And that leads me into a pitch. We didn't include it this year, but I'll talk about it. We made all of our, I think we talked about it a couple of years ago, we made all of our security training courses freely available online through our NSE Institute. I would encourage everybody to go take some courses. If you're not a security guy, go take some courses. Make sure you understand the basics, because nothing is worse than just thinking that you got it and not really making sure that you understood what you just set up. And you may have left something open and you don't really understand that. So make sure you know what you're doing, which I know sounds very trite, but man, security, again, as a networking guy who came over into a security company, man, there's a lot you don't know. and that I will say is the one dangerous thing about harmonizing on to a security appliance is if you're just the networking guy plunking away and doing stuff, if you aren't validating what you're doing with someone who knows security, you may do something that actually leaves you open and you don't realize that you did that.
And will the Fortinet management that you were talking about today help me identify all of those?
We actually do have that. We have something called security rating, and we can even do that. So that's something that you can just run yourself, or we can do it as a service where we will, bring experts to bear and say, hey, you probably meant to do the right thing, but we're giving you an F on your security rating, and here's why. And wireless does roll into that as one of the things that we take into account, but it includes everything. So we'll look at your full footprint of how you've configured that FortiGate, and we'll come back and say, here's what we saw, here's what we rated, here's why we rated you this way, here's the settings that are causing you to get a big fat F, and what we think you should be doing about that. So that is something that we offer both built into the gate, and we can even do it up at the FortiManager level. So that if you wanted to kind of see your aggregate security score, we can do that. You can see your security rating so that you can get a good feel for, did I do something?
Yeah, it'd be nice to have all that knowledge in your AI.
Yeah, so I agree. I don't disagree with you. We do have some security AI products as well. Like I said, it's always a fine line of how many different products we talk about and how many 40s we hit you with. But yes, I don't disagree at all.